Lieutenant Commander Sarah Jenkins stood at the edge of the massive indoor pool at the Naval Amphibious Base in Coronado, her arms crossed over her chest. The air was thick with the smell of chlorine and the kind of tension that only existed in places where men and women were pushed past their breaking points. She watched as a group of new BUD/S trainees, all muscle and bravado, struggled through another evolution of underwater knot tying. They were young, most of them, with the kind of unearned confidence that came from being the toughest kid in their high school. Sarah knew that confidence. She had once worn it herself, a lifetime ago. Now, at 34, she carried herself with the quiet, watchful stillness of a predator. Her hair was cropped short, practical, and her blue eyes missed nothing. She was not here to train these boys. She was here for something else entirely. Her presence was an anomaly. In a world of crew cuts and desert tan, she was a woman, and worse, a Mustang, an officer who had risen from the enlisted ranks. To the men shivering in the pool, she was a curiosity. To their instructors, she was a rumor made flesh. They had all heard the whispers, the stories that clung to her like shadows, but no one knew what to believe. The commanding officer of the training command, Captain Miller, a bull-necked man with a lifetime of salt in his veins, approached her. He was followed by a cluster of officers, including the lead instructor for this class, a senior chief named Kowalski. Kowalski was a mountain of a man, a decorated SEAL with a chest full of medals and an attitude that matched his size. "Lieutenant Commander," Miller said, his voice a gruff bark, "the senior chief here has a question for you." Kowalski stepped forward, a smirk playing on his lips. He looked her up and down, not with the subtle assessment of a fellow warrior, but with the dismissive curiosity of a man looking at a zoo exhibit. The trainees in the pool had stopped their exercises, their eyes glued to the scene unfolding on the deck. "Ma'am," Kowalski began, his voice loud enough for everyone to hear, "I was just explaining to my class about the different roles in the naval special warfare community. We got our operators, our support personnel, our intel weenies." He paused for effect, letting the laughter ripple through the gathered men. "And I told him we even have some folks who do a lot of paperwork. Told him about your background. In counterinsurgency. With the, what was it? The entomology unit?" A few of the trainees snickered. Entomology. Bugs. The implication was clear. They saw a staff officer, a woman who had spent her career in a lab far from the real fighting. Sarah did not react. She simply looked at Kowalski, her gaze as flat and empty as a winter sky. She had been looked at this way 1,000 times before, by men in the field, by men in Washington, by the very enemies she hunted. "That's correct, Senior Chief," she said, her voice calm, almost pleasant. "Defense Science Board. Special study on biological threats in caves and underground facilities." Kowalski's smirk widened. He turned to address his class, playing to his audience. "See that, boys? She's an expert on creepy crawlies. Probably got a kill count of about 100 flies with a swatter. Right, ma'am?" The laughter was louder this time, a few of the younger men slapping the water in amusement. Captain Miller's jaw tightened, but he said nothing. He was curious to see how this would play out. Sarah took a single, silent step forward, her eyes never leaving Kowalski's. When she spoke, her voice was still calm, but it cut through the laughter like a knife. "You're right, Senior Chief. My official kill count, as confirmed by Joint Special Operations Command, is 147. The laughter died instantly, replaced by a stunned, heavy silence. The only sound was the gentle lapping of water against the tile. Kowalski's smirk froze on his face. 147? That was a number that belonged to seasoned operators, to legends. It was not a number that belonged to a woman from an entomology unit. Sarah let the silence hang for a beat, 2 beats, 3. She watched the confusion dawn on their faces, watched them try to reconcile the quiet woman in front of them with the staggering number she had just uttered. "Those are confirmed kills," she continued, her voice dropping slightly, forcing them to lean in. "They don't count the ones that weren't found for a few days. or the ones that died later from secondary infections. The air in the pool deck became thick, suffocating. The trainees were no longer snickering. They were staring, their mouths slightly agape, their young minds struggling to process the information. Kowalski's face had lost its color, replaced by a deep, mottled red. He had just been publicly humiliated by someone he had dismissed as a paper pusher. Sarah looked past him, directly at the wide-eyed trainees in the water. "Your senior chief thinks I'm here to talk about ants," she said, her voice now carrying a hard, crystalline edge. "I'm here because I'm the leading expert on a particular type of covert warfare, the kind you can't win with a gun or a knife." She turned her back on Kowalski, a gesture of utter dismissal that was more cutting than any insult, and walked away from the pool. She left behind a wake of stunned disbelief and a single terrifying question hanging in the air. What kind of warfare leaves a body count in the hundreds? And what does it have to do with bugs? 4 years earlier, Sarah Jenkins was not Lieutenant Commander. She was Senior Chief Petty Officer Jenkins, and she was dying. Not from a bullet or a bomb, but from the inside out. She lay on a cot in a tiny, sweltering field hospital in the Kunar province of Afghanistan, her body ravaged by a fever that wouldn't break. The world swam in and out of focus, a blur of canvas walls, the incessant buzz of flies, and the hushed, worried voices of the medics. She had been on a routine reconnaissance patrol with a team of Army Rangers, her job to assess the local ecosystem for a civil affairs project. They had stumbled upon something else entirely, a complex of caves newly excavated, hidden deep in a remote valley. It wasn't a simple terrorist hideout, it was a laboratory. Before they could call in the find, they were ambushed. The firefight was brutal, short, and bloody. Sarah had fought, emptying her carbine, dragging a wounded ranger to cover, and then everything went black. She woke up here, in this makeshift hospital, her body burning. The doctors were baffled. It wasn't a virus, not one they could identify. It wasn't bacterial, at least not any bacteria their limited tests could detect. They pumped her full of broad-spectrum antibiotics and waited. She grew worse. On the third night, delirious with fever, she had a visitor. A man in civilian clothes, his face unremarkable, his eyes the color of slate. He showed her a badge she didn't recognize and pulled up a rickety wooden stool next to her cot. "We need to talk about what you saw in those caves, Senior Chief," he said, his voice low and urgent. Sarah struggled to focus. "The caves, they were a lab, glassware, generators, it was a lab." "We know," the man said. "Our satellite imagery confirmed it, but we didn't know what they were doing in there. The team that went in after the ambush, they found things, samples, cultures." He paused, looking at her with an unreadable expression. "They also found a lot of dead insects, thousands of them, all of a species not native to that region." Sarah's feverish mind struggled to connect the dots. Insects, a lab, her illness. "They weaponized them," she whispered, the horrifying realization dawning on her. "They weaponized a pathogen, used insects as the delivery system." The man nodded slowly. "We think so. We think you were exposed, and now you're the only living sample we have of what it does." The man was from the Defense Intelligence Agency. His name was Martin, or so he said. Over the next few weeks, as Sarah fought for her life, he became a constant presence. She was eventually medevaced to a secure military hospital in Germany, then to a classified facility in Maryland. Her body was poked, prodded, and analyzed. She was a specimen, a data point. The fever eventually broke, but the damage was done. The pathogen had left its mark, attacking her nervous system, leaving her with a slight tremor in her left hand and a burning, obsessive need to understand what had nearly killed her. She was medically disqualified from further field duty. Her career as a Navy SEAL, a path she had fought tooth and nail to carve for herself, was over. She was offered a medical discharge, a pension, a quiet life. She refused. Instead, she used her new reality as a weapon. She went back to school, cramming years of biology, entomology, and epidemiology into months. Her mind, always sharp, was now a focused instrument of vengeance. The DIA, impressed by her drive and unique insight, recruited her. She became a spook, an analyst. But Sarah didn't want to just analyze threats. She wanted to find them, and she wanted to end them. Martin, now her handler, secured her a spot on the Defense Science Board. Her cover was perfect, a washed-up SEAL turned bug scientist. No one looked twice at her. She spent her days in libraries and labs, studying the natural world's most efficient killers, insects. She learned how to breed them, how to weaponize them, and crucially, how to track them. She learned to read the landscape not for signs of an ambush, but for the subtle clues that revealed a biological warfare program, a concentration of dead livestock, an unusual blight on crops, a sudden spike in a particular disease. It was all connected. It was all a language, and Sarah became fluent. Her first operation was in the jungles of South America. A CIA informant had reported a strange laboratory run by a drug cartel, a place where they weren't just processing cocaine. Sarah, embedded with a small team of intelligence operatives, confirmed it. They were weaponizing the local sandfly population, trying to create a delivery system for a strain of leishmaniasis, a horrific flesh-eating disease. The cartel planned to use it against rival gangs and government officials. Sarah didn't go in with guns blazing. She went in with a tiny, sterile container. She identified the specific fungus that was a natural predator to that species of sandfly. Within weeks of a covert dissemination operation, the cartel's lab was overrun. Their weapons were dying, and their entire multi-million-dollar program collapsed into chaos. The cartel leaders, enraged and panicked, turned on each other. The operation was deemed a complete success. The official report mentioned environmental factors and internal cartel strife. It did not mention Sarah Jenkins. That was kill number 1 through 43. The sandflies weren't counted. The cartel members who died in the ensuing power struggle were. The next target was a splinter cell of a known terrorist group in North Africa. Intelligence suggested they had acquired a crude biological agent and were planning to use it in a major European city. A direct assault was deemed too risky. If the agent was released, the consequences would be catastrophic. Sarah was given a satellite image of their compound and a simple directive: stop them. She studied the region's ecology. She found her weapon in the date palms that surrounded the compound. A specific species of beetle, the red palm weevil, was a devastating pest, capable of destroying an entire grove. Sarah, working with local assets, arranged for a few dozen infected weevils to be released near the compound's water supply, which was stored in large, open-top barrels made from palm wood. The logic was simple. The beetles would be attracted to the wood, bore into it, and die. But the fungus they carried would thrive in the damp, dark environment of the water barrels. It worked. The terrorists drank the contaminated water. Within days, they were all violently ill. Not dead, but incapacitated, too sick to carry out their plot. A follow-up raid by a local special forces team captured them without a single shot being fired. The plot was foiled. The death toll from the biological agent was 0, but the long-term effects, the specific fungal infection left untreated, was fatal in 60% of cases in that environment. Sarah didn't ask for follow-up reports. She knew the number: 47 more. Her legend grew in the darkest corners of the intelligence community. To the men in suits, she was an asset, a unique and terrifyingly effective tool. To Sarah, it was simple. She was hunting the hunters. She was using nature's oldest weapons against the men who sought to pervert them for murder. Each operation was a new piece of a horrifying puzzle, and she was beginning to see a pattern, a shadowy hand guiding these disparate groups, providing them with knowledge and resources. The question was, who was the puppeteer, and where would they strike next? The pool deck in Coronado felt a million miles away from the caves of Afghanistan or the jungles of South America. After her confrontation with Kowalski, Sarah was summoned to Captain Miller's office. The old man sat behind his desk, a sheaf of papers in front of him. Kowalski stood in the corner, his arms crossed, his face a thundercloud of suppressed rage and humiliation. "Lieutenant Commander," Miller said, his voice carefully neutral, "I think you owe my senior chief an explanation." "I owe him nothing, sir," Sarah replied, her voice flat. "He asked a question. I gave him an answer." "That number," Kowalski burst out, unable to contain himself any longer. 147 confirmed kills. That's more than most guys on DevGru. It's a lie. It has to be. Sarah looked at him, and for the first time a flicker of something cold and old stirred in her eyes. "You want proof, Senior Chief? You think kills only happen at the end of a barrel? You think the only way to be a warrior is to look a man in the eye while you pull the trigger?" She reached into the pocket of her uniform blouse and pulled out a small, leather-bound notebook, worn and stained. She opened it to a page filled with dates, coordinates, and notations in a tight, precise hand. She held it out to Miller. The captain took it, his eyes scanning the pages. His face, already pale, went ashen. "Operation Silent Spring," Sarah recited, her voice devoid of emotion. "Venezuela. 43 hostiles neutralized via introduced predator species. Confirmed by CIA Field Office, Caracas." She waited a beat. "Operation Date Palm, Libya. 47 high-value targets neutralized via waterborne pathogen. Confirmed by local asset, corroborated by SIGINT intercepts." She continued, listing operation after operation, each one a ghost story, each one a chapter in a secret war no one would ever read about. The names were innocuous, poetic even, but the numbers beside them were a ledger of death. A training camp in Yemen, neutralized by a plague carried by local rodents. 31. A meeting of senior leaders in the Horn of Africa, disrupted by an aggressive strain of meningitis spread by respiratory droplets in a poorly ventilated bunker. 12. A biological weapons lab in the tri-border area of South America, rendered inoperable by a fast-spreading blight that destroyed their entire stock of culture media. 14. By the time she finished, the room was silent. Miller stared at the notebook, his hands trembling slightly. Kowalski looked like he had been punched in the gut. The reality of what he was hearing was beyond his comprehension. This wasn't war, this was something else. This was applied apocalypse. This is classified beyond top secret," Miller finally managed to whisper, his voice hoarse. "Yes, sir," Sarah said, taking the notebook back and returning it to her pocket. "It is. And now, Senior Chief, you understand why my expertise in ants might be considered a little more valuable than your expertise in push-ups." The barb was surgical. It wasn't meant to wound, but to define. It was the difference between the hammer and the scalpel. Kowalski said nothing. There was nothing to say. He had been confronted not by a rival, but by a force of nature he couldn't comprehend. A week later, Sarah was back in a windowless room at the DIA headquarters. Martin sat across from her, his slate-gray eyes fixed on a satellite image on the screen. "We have a problem," he said, pointing to a region in Southeast Asia. "A big one. Our sources indicate a merger, a confluence of intent and capability we haven't seen before. A known terror network, flush with cash, has made contact with a rogue state's biological weapons program." Sarah leaned forward, studying the image. It showed a dense, mountainous jungle, bisected by a river. It looked peaceful, antic, and utterly lethal. "They're setting up a joint facility here," Martin continued. "Deep in the jungle. The terrain is impossible for a conventional raid. Satellite coverage is limited by the canopy. We have no human assets within 100 miles. But we know what they're working on." He looked at her, his expression grim. "They're not just weaponizing a pathogen this time, they're engineering one, a hyper-virulent strain of a hemorrhagic fever. They're using a local insect vector. If they succeed, and if they release it, we're looking at a potential pandemic." Sarah stared at the image, her mind already racing. The jungle, the insects, the pathogen. It was the same equation, but the variables had grown exponentially more dangerous. This was the puppeteer's masterpiece. This was the culmination of every fragmented plot she had spent years dismantling. "How long?" she asked. "Best guess? 6 weeks until they have a viable weaponized agent." Sarah nodded slowly. The tremor in her left hand was a little more pronounced. She thought of the cot in Afghanistan, the burning fever, the slow, horrifying realization of what had been done to her. She thought of the men she had stopped, the lives she had saved, the secrets she carried. This was why she had survived. This was the moment her entire strange, bloody path had been leading to. "I'll need a team," she said, her voice quiet and steady. "Not SEALs, not Rangers. I need a biologist, an entomologist, and a climatologist. I need to understand this place, every living thing in it. I need to know what can kill them and what can save us." Martin looked at her, a flicker of something like respect in his cold eyes. "You'll have whatever you need." Sarah looked back at the satellite image, at the innocuous green blur that held the potential for unimaginable horror. The Admiral who had once mocked her kill count, who had seen her as a novelty, a paper pusher, had no idea. The Navy SEALs who trained in the pool at Coronado, who measured their worth in push-ups and miles run, had no idea. They lived in a world of clear enemies and open battlefields. Sarah Jenkins lived in the shadows, in the spaces between, in the microscopic world where a single bite could start a war, and a cleverly deployed fungus could stop one. Her war was silent, invisible, and utterly without mercy. She was no longer just a soldier, she was an exterminator of the worst kind of pest. And her work was just beginning.